if I were to retitle this, I would really retitle it The Myth of David the King, because I want to work with you on seeing the mythic elements in this story, that is, the larger, universally human elements. But this is what I propose to do, to touch a little bit on the contemporaneous manifestation of this kind of tradition today. Just a word on psychology and myth from a classical Jungian point of view, which I take myself to represent. Word about David and the historical David, and David in sacred history, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and then talk about the form of sacred biography, the cultural form of sacred biography, which is part of what we have in the scriptures and in our subsequent reading. I'll address David in Western literature and show you a resource on that and just go over some of the richness of that. Then we will talk about David as paradigmatic man and looking at some elements in the story which reflect this. And we will touch on this issue of election, origins, calling. We will put it in the context of the myth of the struggle for cosmos or world, which is really the location of this story mythically. So we have to touch the traditions that Mircea Eliade has done so well to inform us about. And I will talk a little bit about the mythology of evil that underlies the structure of this story, both in its sense of the public nature of evil, the evil out there, and its sense of the enemy, the evil within, because there's no story that really captures both the sense of evil from the outside and evil from the inside any better than this story. And we will focus then on some of the motifs about David in the mythology of the center, which is always in relationship to the task of world making. How do you find the center? How do you constitute it? How do you defend it? How do you have it work appropriately? How do you keep it from being overwhelmed with hubris and then fall into chaos again? In that, those of you that have studied this material, I'm so happy that you're here. I want us to at least touch on David in the Ark of the Covenant, and the whole fantasy about the temple, because it's so contemporary today, and put all this in the context of the Messianic hope, and that's really what I want to start with when we get into this, and then the expectation of the real David, which goes on. So let's just jump in. We'll see how far we can get before I'll probably need to take until between 12:15 and 12:30 to get all this in. But if it's okay with you, let's just jump into that. Just a personal note. As you know, I'm a Jungian analyst, and for many years I have been interested in the relationship between psychology and myth. And I have sort of, many of you have known this story, bear with me, I have sort of recapitulated the history of the psychoanalytic tradition. My first book was a Freudian book. My first psychoanalytic diploma was an Adlerian psychoanalytic diploma. And I finally got an opportunity to study deeply in the Jungian tradition and became a Jungian psychoanalyst. And I like to say I'm a Jungian psychoanalyst not because I don't know something else. I choose to be associated with this tradition because I think it's the most adequate tradition, which has built within it assumptions which do not reduce human beings to caricatures of the human. Many psychologies today are really an embarrassment to me because of the way in which they depreciate the human. They make it small. They make it pitiful. Under the guise of making people healthy, they make them gray and ordinary and depressed. And I'm happy to say that within Jungian psychology, it's not always accessed by people, but within this tradition is a view of the human which sees it as very, very golden. That the potentials in you are rich and golden, and they are large. And the forces that are a part of your biological and spiritual birthright are large, magnificent forces. And a part of our struggle, and this you can hear the David thing here, see, part of our struggle and how hard it is for us to form a human and humane world is because of the size of the things that are in us. These dragons of Eden that are huge, or that's Chinese tradition speaks of the great dragons within us that are ambivalent in their meaning. They're positive and they're negative. Or among some men in the mythological traditions drawn by Michael Meade and others today, we speak of the horses of power in the soul. There are great horses of power that are very difficult to ride. And so Jungian psychology has what in theological circles would be called a high vision of the human. And so that is, I think, its strength. In the context we live in today, it's clear to me that if we don't get some very large human beings committed to dealing with the situation we find ourselves in on this planet, we will have no hopeful future. So our task, as I see it, is in helping people move from a sort of a leaden view of themselves, which sees themselves as insignificant and impotent to do anything to make this world a better place, to move from that to a vision of themselves as Charles said earlier about the topic of election, to see themselves as elect in some meaningful sense, chosen to express large energies in the service of the human community. Quite frankly, I think if we don't do that, we have no hopeful future. And everybody's always telling me that I'm romantic and that I'm too idealistic. If I were more realistic, I wouldn't feel that way. I think they're totally wrong. The people that don't see that as the situation are simply in massive denial. They do not see the size of the problems we face, and therefore they don't have to face how large they would have to become if we were to effectively address them. So Jungian psychology addresses this how? By valuing myth. Why is that important? Because in tribal cultures throughout the world, all traditions, they saw their task as helping their young men and women find their size in myth. Mythological traditions were not to control and make young males and females small, as a lot of our scholars today like to tell us. You know, you give somebody a PhD and they think they have immaculate perception. And there are a lot of people in very prestigious universities that will tell you they know the meaning of myth and what it's about. And the people that have the biggest academic reputations today are the ones that tell you that myth has no wider human meaning, that it's merely related to the particular social location of the particular group. There's nothing that can be generalized from one tradition to the other. And that now it's politically correct to say that if you see anything really universally human that comes out of these mythological traditions, you're really a sort of a closet fascist, and really totally misusing other people's myths. That's the popular academic view now. That's politically correct academia. So that amazes me. Just amazes me, because that's directly tied to the lack of a willingness to understand that we are one species and that our psyche is grounded in the evolutionary body. And these people that try to use a sociological reductionism to miss the whole human usage of myth in maturation are totally making us into angelic creatures who are disembodied and therefore have nothing in common with each other. So I want to really get you to get the point. From a Jungian point of view, mythology is not something other than human behavior. From a classical Jungian point of view, mythologizing is what this species does. Mythology is animal behavior. We are the animal that makes myths. We are the animal that does ritual. There are many other animals that do ritual, actually. And the more we study this, we realize that somehow mythological and ritual practice is really something that grows out of our evolutionary heritage and is a part of our biological potential. And so we have to ask the question, this is what I ask as a psychoanalytic scientist. I say, okay, now what is this stuff doing here? Why is it that tribal peoples all over the world elaborated these mythological stories and initiated their young people into them? Well, what I'm suggesting is to you, and I lecture on this a lot of places, and those lectures are available, that what is happening is that these tribal peoples understood that in order to get mature human beings who are not narcissistic personality disorders or sociopaths, that you have to get them into myth. In short, I'm publishing around this now. My argument is to all of my psychoanalytic colleagues of all schools, the only cure for narcissistic pathology is myth. And those that don't understand that are probably not dealing with their own narcissistic pathology. They are wanting to be mythologized themselves. A lot of Freudian analysts do not want to get into this very much because they want to retain an idealizing transference to themselves. An idealizing transference is a mythological phenomenon. Idealizations that you might have of me or I might have of you ultimately need to take their place in mythological containers. And that's a radical position, but one that I think we'll see as we go is one that's defensible on all kinds of fronts. So anyway, for a Jungian, classical Jungian point of view, you study myth not because it's just interesting old stuff. You study it because it's a mirror to your species. And we look at these myths to find ourselves. And we look at these myths and these mythic stories to find what our forebears learned about the temptations of being human. What did our forebears learn about the temptations of being a female human? What did our forebears learn about the temptations of being a male human? The temptations somewhat overlap, but not totally. And we need to keep that kind of thing in mind as we go. Okay. So when we look at this story, when I look at it, I'm not André Lecoq. I'm not coming at it as a professor of Hebrew Scriptures. I come at it as a human scientist. I look at it for what it can tell me about the human psyche, and then what it has to say for our current struggle for maturation as a species. But let me start now. You can't really talk about this without talking about Hebrew Scriptures and what that is. Let me give you a reference that I've found useful on running down some of these scriptural traditions about David. This is a recent little book by Walter Brueggemann, Bruegggeman, called David's Truth in Israel's Imagination and Memory. David's Truth in Israel's Imagination and Memory. In it, he shows the way in which these traditions about David are a part of a narrative tradition informed by the commitments of Israel as a people and as a historical community. And he talks about the view of David from the tribal perspective in Judaism, the trustful truth of the tribe. He talks about the view of David by those people who were trying to create a monarchy in Israel, and the difference between that and the tribal perspective, the sure truth of the state about David. And then after the collapse of the monarchy, the hopeful truth of the assembly, that is the people that are remembering David while they're in exile from Israel. And he lays this out in a beautiful way, and those of you who have not done any analysis of the text, you just need to get your Bible in one of the good translations if you're not fortunate enough to know Hebrew. If you're fortunate enough to know Hebrew, that's one thing I'm kicking myself all over the place. When I had an opportunity to study Hebrew, I didn't really immerse myself in it, and now I'm finding out that there's a lot of things that you can see about archetypes if you know Hebrew in this tradition that you can't see if you don't know the Hebrew. So you got to get a friend that knows the Hebrew, like I do. But anyway, so you get these two, and they'll help you a lot getting into the unique historical traditions about David particularly in the Judeo-Christian tradition. But I wanted to point out that one of the important things to realize is that this is not just a Jewish story. It's not just a Christian story. It is also a story that has had enormous influence on Islam. So it's probably we have a person from a Muslim background here with us today. One of our dreams at Chicago Theological Seminary, Andre and I, is we do a lot of conferences bringing together Jews, Christians, and Muslims around important texts. And one of the things that Andre and I want to do is to have a conference on David, which will bring together outstanding Muslim scholars and Jewish scholars and Christian scholars and psychoanalysts, Freudian and Jungian, on this topic. And we hope we can do that in the next few years. But anyway, in other words, this sacred Heilgeschichte, the salvation history, the role of David in it is important not just to Judaism, but to all of these major traditions of the book. And they all treat the role of David in this redemptive process, God's redemptive process in the world. And you want to be thinking about this redemptive process with two eyes. You think with a theological or mythological eye, and you think about it with a psychological eye. And this afternoon we'll look at it with a psychological eye. But this is a good place for me to talk about this messianic hope, the mythology of the messianic hope. People that do not know better think that the expectation about the coming of the true king to liberate the world from chaos and evil and bring about shalom, a world of justice and peace, a lot of people think that that's just an American Christian fundamentalist expectation. They could not be more incorrect in their assumptions about that. If you look at the beginning of this book, The King Within, that Douglas Gillette and I recently published, we talk about the universality of this longing for the return of the liberator. We see this in popular film today. I mean, if you look at the archetypal structure behind many of the movies that are so popular today, you see this motif lurking behind the storyline. There was a report yesterday that among all people, the most popular male figure, get this now, the most popular male figure in film for people of all ages is Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. I want you to see the tie to David in that story. Indiana Jones is directly tied to this David tradition. Among young men, men who are in their 30s or younger, and I think also among women, I'm not sure about that, but the figure that is the most popular figure is Arnold Schwarzenegger in his role in that Terminator series, particularly Terminator 2. Underlying the stories in those films, Terminator and the sequel to that, is this myth of the liberator, the myth of the liberator, the return of the liberator king. You can see it very clearly once you look at that. What we have found by studying comparative mythology, comparative religion, is that each of these spiritual traditions expects someone to come and deal with the chaos. In a moment, I'll be talking about the combat myth. And let me give you a reference on that. It's Forsyth's book, Forsyth. It's called The Old Enemy. And it is a story. It is a treatment, a cross-cultural treatment of the combat myth, which is about the return of the true king who will confront chaos. So in Zoroastrianism, you had the expectation of Sayoshant, the return of Sayoshant, who would bring about justice and defeat the forces of evil. In Buddhism, you have the traditions with regard to the return of Maitreya, the coming of Maitreya, the final Buddha, who will bring about liberation and peace. In Islamic traditions, there are many, many traditions about the expectations of the Mahdi, who is the one who will bring about the final consolidation of Allah's truth in the world. And you can go on and on and on. In science fiction, if you like film, see the movie Dune, which is a contemporary science fiction appropriation of this thing about the return of the true king, who is able to harness the power of the great giant worms that live in the depths, and is able to ride those and become so empowered that one can then liberate the world from the evil of the empire. The Star Wars series has the same motif. The mythology, then, that underlies this story is cross-cultural, interfaith, multidisciplinary in terms of places where you can locate it. So this Redeemer myth that is going to start coming in very rapidly upon us more powerfully now as we approach 2000, as we approach the turn of the millennium, we're going to have a flood of increase and the emotional experience of the expectation of His return. And the His will be seen differently. But the emotional experience of the excitement of the coming closer of the decisive battle with evil will become much more stimulating in the human psyche cross-culturally. All that Mideastern war stuff, if I had time, I would show you the way in which this myth played itself out in the discussions and the fantasies about this Middle Eastern war that recently occurred. So this is a large context, but we get the David story. We need to understand that in our Western literature, this has been an enormous influence. This is something I did not really have any sense for whatsoever. Let me just give you a few insights from this book. And this is another book I think you should get if you're really interested in this. It's called The David Myth in Western Literature. It's edited by Raymond Frontain, Frontain, and it is based on a conference that was held some years ago on David. But they point out that in the history of Western literature, there is simply no figure that has dominated the images of the human in the way in which David has. They call this story a classical story, in the sense that a classical story remains unsurpassed because it provides patterns to think or imagine your way through a particular concern that's universally human. And what they do in this presentation, which treats all these different literary traditions, is to show the way in which the story of David, in a way that is unparalleled, shows the existential conflicts and difficulties involved in what we would say, at least in the masculine experience of human existence. A lot of it involves themes that we'll get to this afternoon about the temptations of the feminine. But the story of David, from their point of view, provides formulas for talking about conflicts, expectable conflicts in the life of a individual man. The poets have talked about David the poet, and there are all these narrative literary traditions about David the poet, and there is the David of the poets, right? And it has allowed the religious teachers and the military leaders, and many times in our Western history they were the same people, to talk about the military David, or what I would say David the warrior. See? And there are these enormous literary narrative traditions which use David as the image of military preparedness and military strategy. And if you choose a figure to talk about generalship, it's David the general. And I'm stunned at the extent of the literature over the past few centuries in the West that talk about this. And so the David that's put in the book of Samuel and the books of Kings is warrior, they say. Now, this is not Jungians talking. You have to understand this is coming from literary critics. This is not anybody that knew anything about archetypal structures of the psyche, right? They say that they talk about David the warrior. There are traditions of David the lover. There are traditions of David the poet. There are traditions of David the killer. There are traditions of David the restorer. They focus on the inherent paradox in his personality. They talk about how he dances spontaneously before the Ark of the Covenant. And that's one image of him. Then they focus on the other image, where he is plotting in a very cunning way the relationship that he's going to have with Saul, both in the present and the future. One image of him is of the anointed one of the true God, and the image of him as the psalmist. And as you know, literary critics depreciate a lot of the psalmist authorship and is not being really Davidic. But in the narrative traditions, David is seen as the psalmist. But then there are the traditions about him as murderer, and the big tradition of him as adulterer. And so the writers of the biblical narratives had already started taking all of these different narrative strands that already existed at the time that they were putting this stuff together. And they're shaping the story and weaving these strands together even 500 years, only about 500 years after the events that they described took place. And the history of Western literature has been replete with the development and elaboration of each of these themes. And the thing that they say, the thing that they point out, are totally without any kind of psychological, technical, professional psychological interest, is they keep pointing out, this is the most human person in the Bible. That is to say, that this person shows all of these struggles with temptations in a more clear way, and the paradox of human existence in a more clear way than anyone else. And a lot of these people argue it's much more clear than Jesus. And we'll have to take up why that might be as we look at the archetypal dimensions of this later today. But this is paradigmatic human, they say. And they say one of the intriguing things about these stories is that unlike much sacred biography in human history, they don't flatten David out and summarize him in simple ways. In the traditions of sacred biography in human culture, usually you'll get a tendency toward two-dimensionality in stories about major figures. In other words, as the stories are told and retold, they start to become archetypes and lose their personal features. And these writers and scholars point out that with David, this is not the case. That a tension is held by the writers and by the people that put the scriptures together. Now, this is an interesting thing to ponder. Now, the people that put the scriptures together, the canon of the Hebrew scriptures together, they were free to do what they wanted to do. Think about this. Why didn't they clean him up? Just ponder this. This is important for us to ponder, and it has implications for the way we look at this. They were free to clean him up, make him sanitary, to sanitize David. And some of the traditions try, you know. What the really good Hebrew scholar can trace in the text, it's just wonderful to see an outstanding Hebrew scholar do this. They can trace these traditions and these strands through the text, and they can show you how the biblical narrative is this wonderful weaving of all these strands together. So it's really intriguing. You start out and you're reading along in the Hebrew, and you'll have this person speaking from the point of view of the tradition which is critical of all kings. And so you've got this sort of anti-monarchical tradition in the text. And so it'll be sort of presenting a David that really was arrogant to think he could be king. But right after that, you will get a monarchical tradition that says, nevertheless, David was wonderful. Now you got to look at that and you got to think about that. You got to think about it theologically, mythically, and then you got to think about it psychologically later. Why don't they clean it up? Well, André Lecoq, this Hebrew scholar, tells me that the best he can tell is that they thoroughly intended to do it this way. That it's not just an accident that all these different traditions about David are woven together in a tapestry to form a non-simplified whole. Now, I take it that that's really important for us that are trying to think psychologically about this, and also to think about the way myth works. Because what we have here, according to these scholars, is a view of David which is fleshed out. The human is not lost in myth here. It embodies all of these mythological themes, but is not lost in myth. And we'll come back this afternoon, and I'll give you my wrap on what I think that's happening here psychologically. But mythologically and textually, in terms of the narrative, remember these tensions about David's truth are kept in purposeful tension as the narrative is written. Now let me turn now to this whole issue of the story of the beginning of David. Those of you that saw the film, how does the film really begin telling this story? It does a good job on sort of the mythic side. How is the story beginning? Somebody that remembers that. What do you start with in this? Anybody?
Samuel is coming to Saul.
Samuel comes to Saul. And what is the feeling presented in that scene of Samuel coming to the first king, Saul?
Direction that he was given, like they conquered them. Yeah.
Right. So what we're given is an image of the first king, the man who would be king, Saul. And we are given this image of the flawed Saul. And what is the flaw in Saul? Well, he does not remember, according to the way that's presented, he does not remember the context in which his kingship is given. He starts becoming a king, as the Hebrew people always said, like the other kings. That's a big important motif. He starts becoming a king like the other kings of the ancient Near East. That is, total unlimited power. Power to not listen to the Lord God. See, so that is an image. What is kingship? Well, this is what it's not supposed to be. That is the beginning of it. And one of the things the writers are trying to do theologically is something that we'll talk about psychologically. That is to say, well, you know, human powers are such that they try to go their own way, that they serve narcissistic interest. And the writers are, from the very beginning of these narratives, talking about leadership having a ground other than personal ambition, or even tribal ambition, or even the people's ambition. That there is some dimension in right leadership that is grounded in a transpersonal, sacred centering. And so there is the context in which this thing starts off. And then we go to the home of Jesse, right? And here we get a really central mythological motif. That is, in these traditions, and they're not just a Jewish tradition, the divine reality doesn't choose in the same way that humans do. And if you look at mythological traditions, the emphasis is always that which seems the most insignificant may be not only significant, it may be of decisive significance. And so you've got to be careful assuming that your ego consciousness, your ambitious narcissistic mind, you've got to be careful in assuming that it knows what is really valuable by itself. And so we are taken to this not too impressive family. And not only that, we are taken to what, from a human point of view, the writers would say, is the least significant of the family. And this is a mythological motif that if you study myth, you'll find this over and over again. The chosen one, the real chosen one, probably doesn't come from the North Shore. The real chosen one probably comes from a ghetto on the West Side. See? Or the real chosen one doesn't come from Chicago or New York City. The real chosen one probably comes from, what's that little town downstate? You know, or even less significant than that, you know. So this is a mythological motif, and it tells us something psychologically and mythically. That is to say, from a mythological point of view, if you get, human beings have always said, if you get your centeredness right, what seems to be significant is probably not. And the real center of redemption and salvation and justice is probably going to come from somewhere that you are not aware of, out of your own human, narcissistic, self-centered consciousness. And so there's a major, major motif that is emphasized here in this story. Picked up again, as you might say later, in the Christian scriptures. What is the situation? Somebody tell me very quickly. What is the situation the Israelites find themselves in at this time in their history? What is Saul struggling with? What's the problem? Who's the problem? The Philistines are the problem. Now, why are the Philistines a problem? Now, there are lots of problems always, but some problems are worse than others. And so what is there about the situation that David is in and the Israelites are in and Saul is in that makes the Philistines a particular problem? Does anybody know from their studies? Yeah.
Is it that they have this one big warrior who's challenged everybody and they have no one to meet him?
Well, is it Goliath? Well, it may be what is symbolized by Goliath in the story.
The part that's never been conquered.
Yes.
Because they never did take that.
Right. The part that's never been conquered, but let's stay with this Goliath image a minute. He is an image of a juggernaut. You might say he is an image of the Nazi war machine at its highest level of flowering. He is an image of high technology in the service of somebody's agenda. High military technology. What the scholars have shown is that the Philistines were a very advanced people technologically for their time, in general. And not only that, they had iron weaponry, which this was the beginning of the coming in of iron weapons into warfare in that part of the world. Their swords did not break as easily as bronze swords. Not only that, they had the forerunner of Hitler's Tiger tanks. They had war chariots, enormous war chariots, which had 3 crew members. And these things were developed into enormous military tactics, enormously effective military tactics by which they would just wipe out infantry. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff that's known about this now. In this course that Andre and I did, we had an archaeologist who had been studying the Philistines, and he was laying out for us what they had in terms of their capacity to challenge the Israelites in terms of their attempt to consolidate a place there. So, what you're seeing here in terms of a myth is an image of the power of the forces which go against your attempt to form a consolidated cosmos, or a world which can be defended. See, human beings, get Eliade's book, Cosmos and History. Mircea Eliade, Eliade, Cosmos and History. He shows that throughout human mythology, humans are concerned about establishing a world which can be defended from evil and chaos, which represents justice and peace and prosperity surrounding a center. So what we are presented with early on is this image of chaos, and the people of Israel being surrounded by enemies who, from a human point of view, were much more heavily armed, in some ways much better led militarily, and so forth. So this is an image that repeats itself throughout world mythology. The forces of evil, contrary to some theologians, the forces of evil are strong, they're organized, they have the best equipment. Now that is the way mythology around the world represents evil. You give it to a theologian, and what they get into, and it's amazing to do this in theological circles here in the city. We're the center of theological education for this part of the world. You give it to a theologian, and what do they want to talk about? Theodicy. When you raise the question of evil to theologians, they want to talk about theodicy, Theodicy, that is, justifying God before the reality of evil. They don't really get into anything practical about the power of evil. They kind of depreciate the power of evil, actually. Whereas mythology emphasizes the power of evil and chaos. And this is true universally, not just in this story. But in this story, we got the mythic pattern. Evil is powerful. All things being equal, the Philistines will triumph without much trouble. Get it? All things being equal. It's like, think about us today as we look at the poisoning of the oceans, poisoning of the waters beneath the land, toxic and atomic waste everywhere, increasing enemy all over the world. The only people that are organized and know what they're doing are the people that are running the drug trade, and the people that are using international business to rip off the entire planet. They're very well organized. They've got the best computers. They're mostly networked. It's the same thing today. And you talk to people that care today, most of them are scared to death and hopeless. And you can think about that as a parallel mythically to the situation being represented here. That is, if you're an informed Israelite, at the time David is still herding sheep, and you're sitting down and you're talking and say, well, we hadn't got a chance against these Philistines. And even though Saul is a mighty warrior and he's doing his best, something is wrong and we're losing. So then we get the liberator discovered by the prophet through divination techniques, not by his knowledge. Samuel doesn't know which one it is, right? He can't just go out there and choose it. So he chooses this figure through the use of divination techniques, and that's portrayed well in the movie. And then you have the liberator king who's going to address the situation of chaos. Comes in, starts to try to find out what needs to be done to begin to bring cosmos out of chaos. The whole story is about this struggle of David to assume his election as king, Yahweh's election as king, and to begin to integrate the efforts of the Israelis, the people of Israel, and to bring about a center in Jerusalem. Now, I meant to mention that I hope all of you will have an opportunity to travel to Jerusalem and actually see for yourself the location of this mythic center that is talked about in this story. It's an amazing thing that has happened there. This is a mythic center for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And this process of David's attempt to establish the center in Jerusalem is something which has had enormous impact on the sacralization of that place for the entire world. There's a sense in which Jerusalem has become sacred space for all of the people of the world, more than people know. And you can go there and you can see the overlapping of the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions at the same place, the same center. I'll talk about that more this afternoon. David struggles. He unites the tribes to struggle against the enemy. He does it in many, many different ways, but he is not one that thinks that military force is the sole answer. And there we get to the issue of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, someone who has studied the Ark and its significance for the people of Israel, would you just say what it was? And go ahead.
The God is what sent us in the new book about the Ark to cover.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Is that the one, The Search for the Lost Ark?
Yeah.
It's an intriguing story. You and I were doing the same thing late last night. Me too. Yes, it is. Because like I say, it's not just Indiana Jones that's interested in finding this lost ark. There's a mythic motif under this, and we'll get him to say more about that later, but we'll say more about the ark. Let's stay with the ark. What is the ark now? Mythically. Well, you know, it carries supposedly the tablets that were given to Moses in the revelation from God. They're there inside, yeah.
For the revealed divine presence?
Yeah, it's a container for the revealed divine presence. It is a vessel of the sacred. You got to understand, the Hebrews, they're a tribal people. They're out there going out, nomadic people. You know, you travel in Israel and those areas now, and you be driving down the road, and there'll be nomadic people out here by the road, still living in the same way that the people of Israel lived in that day. Practically exactly in the same way. And herding their goats and sheep in very similar ways. But these were nomadic people, and they would carry this center with them, a transportable center. Now, that's something interesting, isn't it? A transportable center. This afternoon, we'll talk about the transportable center of the psyche. You carry it with you all the time, you know, in here. Yes?
Since I came today, at first I was going to say it wasn't. A couple of days after first finishing the book this morning, made a decision to come to this.
Yep.
The other thing is what's happening out in L.A. or what happened to them.
Yep.
And as you talk deep around for David in terms of Philistine, you know, the power, the number for evil of the original center.
And no hope.
And no hope.
And no hope.
And no David.
And no David. At least out there.
Yeah. Right.
See, that's what we're going to have to end with today. Is there a real David or not? See.
The word.
I think it's safe to say, choke up on that, see? Can't even talk. I think it'll be safe to say that the presidential candidates from whatever party, even Ross Perot from down home, is not David, is not the real David. And but anyway, you do context it, I think, rightly. This is, see, myth lives. We are in this same situation, and it might be a good idea for us to get it right about this rather than wrong, see, in terms of where the real David is. Yes?
What's interesting is you said about the military force wasn't the only option.
Yes.
And my understanding, and I should be very wrong, I need to be corrected on this, but Shekinah is feminine. And so the container for the web of the war machine, masculine, and the Shekinah, feminine, that would bring the integrated strength that's needed here.
Right. Jewish mysticism is rich, and you ought to look at the books of Gershom Scholem to study the rich traditions about the balance between the masculine and the feminine in God, in the nature of God. You can't get it from exoteric Judaism, but you can get it from esoteric Jewish mysticism. There's much more emphasis on the balance of masculine and feminine in God in Jewish mystical tradition. But for our purposes about the ark, back to the ark. In that center, the divine presence in all of its form is honored. In the tradition, it's presented as being so powerful that if you touch it, even if you mean well, it kills you. Very interesting in terms of archetypal energy, we'll see this afternoon. Jung was different from a lot of Jungians, he didn't romanticize archetypal energy. He knew archetypal energy was not friendly in a sort of a romantic way. Sacred energy is enormous and must be related to with respect. You start relating to it without respect, you die. So we'll be talking about some of that importance of that. But one of the things I didn't realize until I started getting into this with our Hebrew scholars is the way in which, and we could have courses forever on this topic, the relationship between the Ark of the Covenant that David is trying to locate and then later bring into Jerusalem to make Jerusalem more sacred, the sacred center, the relationship between that and the creation in Genesis. Not only that, the relationship between the ark and the shape of the Garden of Eden, the relationship between the Ark of the Covenant and Noah's Ark. There is a direct symbolic line, mythic symbolic line from creation, Sabbath, Noah's Ark, Ark of the Covenant, temple. That is an integrated symbolic line. Now, they never taught me that. I don't know why they didn't, but they never really talked about that. Yes. Yes.
I may learn about this. Was that involved in some way with war? And the reason I'm asking is because when she started talking about, the feminine container, it brought to mind some of the traditions of the Bedouins going into battle, that they would take a woman on a camel, put in a enclosure that was like square, and she was there during the time of the battle. And if they could, knock her off, stop her out of the camel, strip her clothes out, or kidnap her, they tend to be the winners of the war. So I just thought of that sense of that feminine being in battle. So I was wondering how that would relate to the art. Is there some sort of connection there?
I'm sure there are a lot of connections, and you have to ask the question. She's talking about the relation of the feminine to all this warrior energy in the ancient Near East. We'll have to come back to this. This is very important. That is, what happens when warrior energy is not integrated into some larger sense of world? And what happens is the feminine and children and all of those without political power are abused. Yes.
I was about to, I think it's one of the prophetic stories I read that when the warriors are sent out and they come back in a rapid mood, they just send a whipping out to calm them down before they're allowed to enter back into the camps.
Yes. The utilization of feminine presence to cool down warrior energies is also a very widespread mythic and psychological pattern. And it's not irrelevant to what we're talking about here, and it's not irrelevant to the task that we face at the end of the story. Not at the beginning, but at the end of the story, the task that we have to take to move the story onward to the future. But stay with this ark thing a minute before we break for lunch. What you got in this image of the ark is an image of the cosmos. The ark is a mythic image which contains within it the structure of the world. And the Hebrew scholars can show you that this is clearly in the text. And not only that, as Mary says, there are all these clear directions about the specifications for the building of these things. And what you got to get if you study Hebrew scriptures is that there is a implied parallelism between the shape of Eden, shape of Ark, shape of Noah's Ark, shape of cosmos as shalom, and shape of the world we hope to come at the end of history, when the real David comes back. See, you get that? That is, there is the shape. The shape implied in this structure is a mythical structure, which implies from Eden, it implies the right world At the beginning, through a process of fall, to the, as Eliade says, to the regeneration of the world, through the actions of the Redeemer. So that is the mythic structure that you can see there, and it's tied into this ark. And remember, at the start of the story, the ark is not in Jerusalem. Get it? Get this. Think about this a minute now before we take our break. I want you to be thinking, okay, so you got the thing that's got the code. The ark has the code for the way it was in the beginning and the way Noah saved the remnant. It's got the same code through which Noah saved the few and kept the cosmos from being destroyed by evil. It's got the same code that could be used to establish the center at Jerusalem the way it ought to be. And it's got the same code through which you build a future that is the future that the true God intends. You see that? Now, nobody taught me that. And I sit there with this colleague, Andre Lecoq, and I listen to him talk about the way in which you can just see it in the text, okay, creation, Eden, and that's there in the Hebrew text. It's not in English. You can't get it by reading English. See? It's not there in the same way as it is in the Hebrew text. And so anyway, before we go to lunch, that's what I want you to get, that there is this image of the ark and David's role of finding the ark where it has been put aside. It's still there, but it's been put to the side. And he brings it in, and those images of David dancing before the ark as they bring it into Jerusalem, what is that mythically? This is the mythic liberator king who finds the code and who is sufficiently, get this now and think about the story, he is sufficiently unashamed of what anybody else is going to think that he's going to dance joyfully before it and ritualize the entry into Jerusalem. Mercy Eliade would say, what is David doing there? Besides what sacred kings always did, dance the world into existence. David is dancing the forecourt. He's dancing the world into existence. That's an ancient practice of the king. But he is, here's the word, mythic word, he is cosmosizing Jerusalem. He's ritually dancing the code into Jerusalem. And attempts are made by important people to shame him about that. And he doesn't buy it. And so there you have the establishment of what Eliade would call the axis mundi, the center of the world tree, the center of all the layers of the world around which now can be established the unification of both the tribes, but also the northern and the southern kingdoms. So we get this imagery of unification of north and south, the unification of the tribes into a world. And whatever else it is, there's your mythic motif of the leader who attempts at least to bring establishment of the center. Yes?
With one of those people who shamed him, his wife?
The daughter of Saul.
Would you like to talk about that later?
Sure, we'll talk about that. And I think that this has to do with gender relationships, but I also think it has to do simply with, get this now, before we stop for lunch. If you start getting significant enough to engage the struggle to establish shalom in this world, now, this mythic pattern will be repeated. There are going to be a lot of people who will ridicule you, and they won't all be females or males. There will be folks that are going to ridicule you for taking yourself seriously as someone who has an investment in the establishment of cosmos. That's the mythic truth behind this. And that is always going to be true. What is the good news? Well, the good news is that that's always, as Eliade points out about myth, that's always a human possibility. You can always engage the task of getting the center where it ought to be. What's the bad news? Bad news is that everybody won't like you about that. That is, if you are doing what you need to do for yourself and the world, and if you are becoming as significant as you need to be for your life and for the life of the world, you're going to get a lot of flack from outside and from in your family. And this is humanly true. And we'll see this afternoon later about how psychologically true it is. We'll talk a little bit about envy and narcissistic needs and the problem of integrating your grandiose energies in a constructive and creative way. But we do need to stop and get some fuel, or we will flatten out. So let's stop and let's try to get back within an hour and 10 minutes. This afternoon I'd like for us to start by picking up a few more of these issues about the mythic themes before we turn to looking at my understanding of the structure of the self and the role of kingship in it, and we can begin thinking about the psychology of this material. But I wanted to come back to this issue of the mythology of evil as it's reflected in this story. We talked about the struggle to achieve cosmos against external forces and the way in which Saul's struggle against the Philistines forms the context for the beginning of the story. And I wanted to lift up a few more themes about that, and then I want us to talk about the enemy within motif by looking at what happened with the David and Bathsheba element in the story, because in terms of the progression of the story and the struggle of good against evil, there's a clear structure in the story that we need to see before we go on into looking at it psychologically. But let me just pick up something that I did not have a chance to emphasize enough. If you remember looking at Saul, Saul was a very mighty warrior. He and his son Jonathan were very, very powerful warriors and generals. And I think it important to look at the way in which Saul is presented here as a sort of a mythic image of warrior struggle. He is seeking to form himself as a king, and the people are seeking to establish him clearly in the context of kingship. But he's constantly seen in the context of struggle and of warfare. And so in the story, you're looking at the future toward the temple, the idea of building a temple and establishing a center in Jerusalem. This is not done in the part of the Saul story, the Saul aspect of the story. So the focus in mythic images in the early part of this story is really dominated by the mythology of the cosmic combat. And so Saul is pictured, he's seeking to become king, but the image is really, this is a general, this is a tribal general. And so it's important for us to see that, and as we get this afternoon into more of the psychology of this, it makes sense psychologically if we understand Saul's paranoia in the context of warrior, the domination of warrior energy. Clearly, the energies that dominate Saul are warrior energies. He is a general, and he's more general than he is king. And you can see that even described in the story if you look very closely at how Spartan his palace is. It's really not an elaborate symbolic center, palace in the sense of a consolidated center. It's more like a general's quarters. It's very much the warrior space, not much symbolism, not much comfort. not much presence of the lover energy there. And it's very interesting. Some of you said that we didn't get to talk enough about David the poet and David the lover. Absolutely, we did not. But you remember those early scenes when David is first brought in, he's brought in not as warrior, centrally, but his first tie is his role in bringing poetry and song into the presence of this feverish, tired, paranoid warrior, leader. And so it's important for us to just look at the way in which this cosmic combat phase in the attempt to form a mythic center of the world, in that phase, warrior energy dominates, and the enemy is all out there. The Philistines, they are the enemy. See, all we have to do is get enough soldiers, and everything will be fine. Get better weaponry, everything will be fine. See. And then we move into David's consolidation of the kingship under the aegis of the true king, the king of the universe, Yahweh. So the true king becomes more clear when David is anointed and is led by the true king of the worlds into his place. Now, one of the things we should be clear about, and we point this out in the book on the King Within, but the rise of Hebrew kingship is a watershed in history, because prior to that, the tendency was in human history for the king to be a god himself. In other words, in psychological terms, an archetype. Here with David, for the first time in human history, the king is human, chiefly, not God. And the king is brought under a king who is the real sacred king in the story. And there are many of us that have studied this stuff that believe that this is a decisive event in human history. That David's struggle to not claim the prerogatives of God for himself as king is this decisive watershed in the attempt, as we Jungians would say, to get the archetype of the self separated from the constellation of the ego or the little s self of the human personality. So many of us believe that that this achievement of the Jewish people marks an enormous step forward in the integration of the human self and the acknowledgement that the divine is not something that one should be totally identifying with. And that's something we can talk about more as we go today. But you can see with David the differentiation. David is human. This is what all the scholars emphasize. They can't believe it. Here is this king who is first and foremost a human being. And the storytellers don't tell us he was perfect. The storytellers tell us about his flaws. The storytellers tell us about his pain. The storytellers tell us about his guilt. The storytellers tell us about his shame. And this is perhaps most significant for all of you midlife males present and listening on this tape. The storytellers tell us about a man whose love is one of his greatest gifts and one of his greatest problems. And kingship had been presented through story after story after tradition, but here you get a king in human history who is presented as full of love. He is full of love for his God. He is full of love for his land. He is full of love for his, we might as well say, brother Jonathan. He is full of love for many women. He is full of love for his sons. And he is so full of love that the narrative invites us to say, what is wrong with the way David is loving here? Now this is clearly paradigmatic of midlife males, because one of the things that those of us that study the male trajectory of individuation, we are very clear that for vast numbers and high percentages of men, this lover aspect of the soul doesn't really get fully online until midlife, and when it does, men start having a David problem in a lot of different ways, and we'll get into that more as we go. And this is really where the story, as it relates to evil, takes this turn. Because the story of David ascends, you can say, the scholars say that you can see this ascension in the fortunes of Israel with regard to the monarchy. It ascends, and it keeps, the integration of the Hebrew monarchy reaches this point, and it climbs to this point, and right at this point, the zenith of the climb, David has always been the kind of king who was always at the forefront of his troops. He did not delegate warrior responsibilities to other people to take the risk. He was always at the forefront. He, like his mentor Saul, was always out there on the point, taking the lead. Things had been consolidated in Jerusalem, and his generals got to worrying about this. You're so valuable. Is this really a good idea for you to be out there leading the troops? Perhaps you should not be with us. Perhaps you should be back safe in Jerusalem. And so this is an interesting part in the narrative. At the very zenith, be thinking about this in terms of the challenge. At the very zenith of the monarchic fortunes, the fortunes of the kingship in Israel, David has been at the lead, taking all the risk with his people. Then they're going to do him a favor and have him stay at home. So here's the zenith. He stays at home. The troops go on off to take care of the wars. David is what? Bored. It's what the scholars tell us. David is bored. And one of the things that happens in archetypal energy is if it's not channeled, what will it do? If you start letting it back up. I mean, does it expend itself usefully? No. What happens is it immediately, if it's not channeled, that's the one thing you can know about the archetypal energy in yourself. If it is not being channeled and contained, you will immediately get into regression and inflation. And depending on the particular shape of your psyche, you will get inflated or you will regress in the form appropriate to your particular psyche. We're all misshapen in different ways. And in our own misshapenness, we have particular archetypal patterns that we're less really integrated than others. And so here is a mighty king and warrior who is full of passionate, erotic love for practically everybody and everything. Now, when you're full of archetypal, passionate, erotic love for everything and everybody, this is very archetypal energy. And one thing that we know about lover energy is extremely hard to contain. It doesn't love containers. Erotic energy doesn't understand container. It doesn't understand walls. It doesn't understand fidelity. Erotic energy is, at the archetypal level, generous. shall we say. Other people might say promiscuous.
What?
That's speaking from the warrior position. From the lover position, it's generous. I have enough for you too. And you too, and her too. And at the archetypal level, for him too, and it too. And, people make jokes about all these New Age types out hugging trees. Well, you can joke about that unless you understand this lover energy in the psyche. And when you're really into that, it loves all things. And that gospel thing about, for God so loved the world, and that should be read, the God who loves all the beings in it. And if you read Genesis in that context, it is God loves so much that he wants as many things as possible there to love. And, it's really a striking thing, the way in which later on we have so demonized lover energy in Western traditions, and the feminine along with it, because the feminine carries so much of it, projected form, that we get into these Gnostic and Manichaean traditions which demonize the world and demonize the body and demonize sexuality, all, in my view, as a defense against our lover energy and our longings to express our love, which are deeply at the root of our selfhood. But in David, he's there at the palace. His troops are out on the front. He's a big man in many, many, many ways. And so he's bored. And so he can't express it in warrior energy. I've got things going pretty well in terms of the kingdom. Where's this energy going to go? Well, all of a sudden he's standing out on the veranda and he sees this beautiful creature disrobing and for her bath. And the narrative is wonderful, the way in which it implicates him. And you just think about it. Now, these are religious writers writing this now. They're not cleaning us up, right? I mean, this is not just an ordinary citizen. Who is this woman? She is the wife of Uriah. So what? Who is Uriah? Who is Uriah? Uriah is a member of David's most elite fighting unit. The one that is the closest to the king. Something that I was not aware of until these people started telling me about the significance of David's particular, almost private army, which he had recruited from around widely. Uriah was not a Hebrew. He was one of the special forces that David had recruited to be one of the chief guardians. So this is one of the men who are sworn to loyalty to protect your life. And so Uriah is an image of a faithful warrior in the service of the king, and the narratives go over and over and over again to emphasize to us that this is a faithful servant of the king. And so we would feel badly for David for choosing to commit adultery with anyone, but to not only commit adultery with the wife of one of his most loyal persons, but then, in order to cover up his deeds, to arrange it, in effect, so that he's murdered. Here again, remember, these are religious writers writing these texts about the person that they would love the most. So what we have here is an image of David at the pinnacle of his power and the pinnacle of his kingdom, being tempted into a grandiosity that, in terms of his own faith commitment, he knew to be wrong. And yet, what is the image here? The image is one of enchantment. She is not aware of what is happening and how evil his action is at this point. So in other words, the evil threat has moved from the Philistines. The threat to cosmos, to world, is no longer projected out there. It's not extroverted. It is an internal tempter. And what is the temptation? The temptation is to lose your sense of limits. In studies of the evil in world mythology, this is probably the most recurrent theme. What is the dynamic of evil? It is a loss of a sense of limits appropriate to your station. David, out of love, not merely lust, loses the sense of his limits. He does this deed and this series of deeds, and the narrative, the interesting thing about the narrative is it goes on and on and on in this elegant way, showing David the trickster. So here is the king who is in effect possessed by the trickster. That's another mythological motif that you got to get clear. This is not kingship. This is the trickster coming in, the king's trickster shadow possesses him, and the narrative shows the lengths to which he goes to try to cover up the criminality of his deeds. See? And then the narrative has the confrontation with the more mature image of the magician or prophet in the form of Nathan. And Nathan tells a story. You remember the story. Nathan tells a story about this man who did this deed. And he gets David into ranting and raving about how evil this deed was that this man had done, and the famous lines that you all know where Nathan speaks to King David and says, "Thou art the man." And there is this moment at which, again, a historic thing occurs that is new in history. Here is a king that could have Nathan killed, drop of a hat. He could kill him. He could do what kings throughout the history had done. I am the law. What do you mean I'm breaking the law? But instead, he realizes that he has stepped beyond his limits. And the whole story has the fortunes of David then and the kingdom going down. See that? There is the zenith, the temptation, the grandiosity, the enchantment, the possession of the, in this case, lover energy, and the trickster energy, and the confrontation with the truth. And even though he repents, the fortunes of the monarchy decline. So in terms of the story, you get external evil and internal evil. And there is the complete picture of the mythology of evil in this story. So hubris, this gets us to Jungian psychology. See, hubris in mythic terms, going beyond the limits, in psychological terms, of course, for us Jungians, is inflation. And so what do we have here? We have a story which tells us, which does not attempt to deny power. It acknowledges power. It acknowledges the goodness of power. It shows its limits. It shows its temptations, that is power in all of its forms, erotic power, political power, military power, the power of knowledge and of the religious cult. We don't have time to get into David the magician very much. We can talk about that now, if some of you have some ideas about that. You know, when I was first studying this, I thought, well, I can see David the warrior, and I can see David the king, and I can see David the lover, but I can't see him as the magician. But the fact is that his wisdom in bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem and his understanding of the importance of the Ark in terms of the consolidation of the kingdom shows the kind of understanding he had of ritual and of the dynamics of the sacred as well. So anyway, that completes that image. Now look at that. The rise of power, the inflation, what Jung would call the movement into being a monopersonality, and then the decline. And then we have the hope of the Israelites from exile, that one day the real David, the new David, the David who will be the way that David should have been, will be back. And when he comes back, he will restore the kingdom, he will rebuild the temple, and he will bring about the kind of peace with justice that David could have consolidated for much longer had he not succumbed to his inflation and his acting out. So there's your mythic cycle there. Any comments now before we go on into looking at this psychologically more? Anybody want to? I mean, there are a lot of things that if we had the time we could lift up, but let's just take a few minutes now to let you comment on things that you see in the myth and the story. Yes.
One of which the similarities I see is the story of Camelot and the Garden.
Yeah.
Where we have a similar situation. In some senses, again, using the Camelot theme, we had that where John getting his evidence and sort of, you go up and obviously he was killed, but again, it's this notion of this team or leader figure, and you consolidate a whole lot of things, and then all of a sudden everything goes haywire. In the case of the story of Camelot, he's supposed to be coming back too at some point. The author is still reducing the kingdom. Yeah. Some people may be believing that John F. Kennedy can come back. I don't know, or something like him. A lot of the
well, the structure of the myth would say that longing. If you go into a lot of very poor homes around the world, particularly in South America, there will be pictures of Jack and Robert Kennedy, along with a virgin. And you need to know that this is the myth. People recognize this liberator king energy when they see it. It's written on their souls. They recognize this energy, and then we've got this problem about it getting killed. So easy for it to get killed or to stub its toe and fall into stuff. And one of the things you notice that with males, you see a lot of the time when this king energy is embodied, we'll see some of the plumbing for this in a minute, but when it gets into a man in a way that is powerful enough for him to provide leadership, it will also often tempt him in such a way to blindness about his acting out that he will often get into various forms of hubris and grandiose acting out, but very often sexually. in terms of promiscuity, and will be blind to this, like Gary Hart. When Gary Hart was fooling around all over the place and had a very good chance to become at least the nominee, if not president, he was saying to the press, just put a tail on me. See? If you got these rumors, just put a tail on me.
Can't the king have anybody he wants?
See, the archetype, that's just very important to raise. He says, can't the king have anyone he wants? In sacral kingship prior to David. See, one of the things people need to hear about David, everybody wants to really make a big deal out of David's adultery here, murder. What they have to realize is for him to even care is revolutionary in history, because the sacral king, prior to this Hebrew revolution in consciousness, see, anybody that's anti-Semitic is just, totally out to lunch about the significance of the Jewish revelation, because there was a decisive movement forward in the evolution of human consciousness with this Hebrew phenomenon here. So in other words, in the kingship of all the other peoples, she's his property. I am the state. You are my property. I have who I want. I kill whoever I want to get who I want. Uriah is my property. I say live, you live. I say you die, you die. I am the law. That was the possession of these sacred kings by the king archetype, which had dominated history. So it's an important point you're making. But you see here in this decisive moment, here is a king who doesn't kill the prophet when the prophet says, thou art the man, but who goes into mourning and can hear the truth. This is a decisive moment when the king and the prophet are brought into our eyes like this, and truth manifests and does what it is supposed to do. The king repents, the prophet is not killed, and in an interesting way, look at this. If this were Samuel would take, Samuel and Saul, look at the change. Samuel did not want Saul to flourish after a certain point. You can see Samuel's hubris as a magician, the inflation of the magician. In this meeting of David and Nathan, the prophet does his work to call the king to accountability. He doesn't want the king to fail. He doesn't want the king to die. He doesn't want the king to be replaced. He wants the king to be faithful. So there's an incredible moment there in which these patterns in the soul hold together and do what they need to do. So that's, we could go on and on about that, but that's an important point you're raising. He acknowledged that this was wrong.
You disidentify with the archetype.
Yes.
Process.
Yeah. He did.
Very hard.
Well, I don't know whether he did later. He's saying that Gary Hart didn't disidentify with the archetype. We don't know what happened. I don't know Hart personally, and I suspect that humility rises after events like that, at least for a while. But one of the things we have to look at here, and this is what we ought to think about this afternoon, is, it's one thing to have disempowered men and women. Disempowered men and women are a lot less problematic in a way. Once they start getting empowered, then you got a problem. Because then they are going to come up on the danger of inflation and become a danger to themselves. And so the issue that you see in this is the struggle of somebody to become fully empowered without becoming possessed by these archetypal energies. Yeah, Mary?
Or we mentioned Alta King, and we know he had his problems with one of their minds. We got David, and then his past with Bathsheba. Well, we get not to Jesus with man, but Christ myth. That's an aspect that's been cut out. It was like almost like it's cut out so that thing could not happen again. And his temptation was like the devil, or he was an aesthetic image, cutting out the sexuality that seemed to have been recalming the past, which carried to the Middle Ages and the Inquisitions and the sexuality and all that. Is that, could that have been deliberately woven? You talked, they didn't do it deliberately.
Let's hold this. This is really important to what we need to talk about now. And I want to just rephrase what she's saying and then make sure we come back to it in the light of the psychology. She's saying that that in that Arthurian legend, the lover relationships are a problem as well and lead to Arthur's downfall, although in a different way. We ought to get into that, the difference, the asymmetry between the David story and the Arthur story, although I want to point out that a lot of the people that study this make a direct tie between David and Arthur. That the people that have studied these traditions see, they never read Arthur outside of the context of David, and intentionally in that context. But, and she's saying that then you get to Christ, you get the way in which the image of, in the mythology of Christianity, the lover stuff does not come in and undo his work in the same way. And is that somehow purposeful in the writers? I think it is, and we'll see some of the dynamics behind that in a minute. But let's look at this handout, and let's go through this quickly. Many of you have studied this stuff extensively. My theories on the structure of the archetypal self. And these lectures on rediscovering masculine potentials and the series of lectures on king, warrior, magician, and lover archetypes, and the lectures on the four couples within. All of these lectures are available that flesh this out. But let me just briefly talk about the image of the structure of the psyche that's imaged here. Jung emphasized the quadrated world, the fourfoldness of things in the human psyche, and in my work and the work that Douglas Gillette and I are publishing, we believe that is deeply based, as Jung thought, in the deep structures of the psyche, but it is not, as Jung and many Jungians think, simply psychological typology. We believe that there are four fundamental biograms in the hardwiring of the human self, both masculine and feminine, that have to be balanced for the integration of a cohesive self. And very briefly, the king and queen, schemas, biograms, archetypes. You know, if you say archetype to a lot of people, they think you're into mysticism. And you are saying something related to mysticism. But when I'm speaking psychologically, I do not mean it to be mysticism. I'm talking about actually innate biological schemas. To me, when you're reading in terms of human psychology, archetype has that kind of valence. So the king and queen biograms have to do with the capacities for inclusive nurturing in the organism. The warrior biograms have to do with what are known as adversarial, aversive, competency, affectance, capacities. Boundary formation, capacity for focus and effective action, Adler talked about the importance of the will to power. This is Adler's argument with Freud. Adler said, no, it's not all erotic. instinct, some of it is aggressive instinct, and they're not the same, and you can't reduce one to the other. Right. There is a separate developmental line for aggression. It's very interesting. Contemporary psychoanalytic theory is finally getting around among many of its avant-garde thinkers in acknowledging that and stopping making this neat little distinction between aggression and assertiveness. It's a developmental line for aggression, yes. I'm saying that in contrast to a lot of the discussion, erotic development is a developmental line. Object relations is a developmental line. A different developmental line is pointed out by White in his work, and by Alfred Adler in his work, and many other psychological theorists who have been avoided by the Freudians, because the Freudians are ambivalent, have been ambivalent about this themselves, because they couldn't get whether Eros and Thanatos were two separate drives or not, and so they finally got off the topic and avoided it. In our work, in my theory, it's clear that these four quarters represent four fundamental developmental lines of biological potentials and spiritual potentials, and they cannot be reduced to each other, and they all must work in mature ways for the self to become fully empowered and cohesive. You can plot, if I had time, and I do it in other lectures, but you can plot the phenomenology of psychopathology on these. The DSM-3R breaks down around this. You can understand the difference in masculine and feminine epidemiologies of psychopathology along these archetypal lines. But I don't have time to get into that here. The other lectures are available that talk about that, and these books that we're publishing address that somewhat. Although the technical stuff it's going to take me another decade to get a lot of that out. Magician in both of these represent a developmental line on cognitive functioning, understanding. This is the developmental line for reflection, contemplation, understanding. When integrated with the other psychological potentials, it gives you a shaman, healer, knowledge used for healing in the human community. When it's not integrated, you get university professors. And arms, the people that develop nuclear weapons. And you get fat man and little boy. You get Oppenheimer's, you get the Manhattan Project in Hyde Park. We Hyde Parkers live on where the world, there was a tear in the fabric of the universe has not been healed. We live on top of it. But anyway, at the lower levels of development of that, you got detached knowledge, which the trickster will use to manipulate everybody and everything for its own ends. When that's integrated with these other potentials, you get the healer, and at the capstone of this pyramid of the developed self, you get the integration of that you see in Mayan culture in the Mayan king, in which the king is king, warrior, sorcerer, and lover. And I'll pass. You can look on the back for the stuff in kingship in a minute, but let me go on around. Lover circuits have to do with affiliative behaviors, capacity for merger, healthy mergers, the capacity for intimacy, the capacity finally for empathy, and for the experience of this, what Heinz Kohut would call vigor, zest, joy in your living. And contrary to what a lot of psychotherapists think because of their own experience, life, we are encoded with the potential to be zestful and joyful and dance this whole business with great passion and not be constantly overwhelmed by chronic depression that we have to medicate in some foolish way. And And this is not something that comes solely from some spirituality cut off from the body and life. It is something given in our species. The ape in us knows all this. And the poisoning of this ape is what keeps us from acknowledging the way in which this joyful embodiment is part of our human birthright that we're still ambivalent about. And we're ambivalent about it, of course, because the shadow side of the lover. All these have shadow sides, dysfunctional, immature expressions. And the lover, of course, you try to build anything and you get lover energy into it, chaos will come in through the lover. Why? Because the lover doesn't understand boundaries. It doesn't understand structures. It understands enjoyment. It understands receptivity and openness. It understands celebration. It understands everything but enemies. It doesn't understand enemy. It can't compute enemy. And the fact is, contrary to what a lot of the sweet people in our world want to have us believe, there are real enemies of the planet that are not a figment of the paranoid imagination. There are real enemies of your life. There are real enemies of your children. And they are very powerful, and they're very well armed, and they're very well organized. And the lover in you does not understand that. It thinks that if you just felt better about it, or whined more, or wept more about this, or loved more, that all that would go away. And so the shadow side of the lover is that you would not want the lover in charge of taking care of you. Because if you put the lover in charge of taking care of you, you are going to be abandoned at the very time when you need somebody at your side, because the lover is going to be loving something else and fascinated with something else other than your needs. And so, but it always loves too much. You've heard of women who love too much? Well, men who are really into the lover love too much. And addicts love too much. And people who are depressive types, people who have to struggle constantly with major depression, love too much. That is to say, technically they don't love too much. They're not containing this erotic energy in a way that serves life. So look at what happens. We get David embodying so much lover, and it's so powerful for him as it is for males. For males, it's such a hard thing for this lover energy, once encountered, not to become so magical that it undoes everything else in their life. It's interesting to reflect on gender differences here. In my understanding of all this, the female gender, unless they've been terribly sexually or physically abused early in life, the female of our species has a kind of capacity for awareness and embodiment of this energy without getting psychotic about it. It's very interesting. So much of the empirical studies bear this out. You take a man who's been married for 50 years, and often he lets his wife carry this lover energy for him throughout the entirety of their marriage. She dies. He has an enormous struggle trying to love life after this and stay alive, and typically dies. The epidemiology shows that they die then. Females, statistically, in an incredibly significant expression, do not let the male in their life carry their lover energy for them. So when the husband dies, the female of our species is able to continue loving widely and does not die at the death of a spouse. And I'm just saying that there's enormous reasons to think that this archetypal hardwiring is directly behind that, and it's one of the things that we have to be more empathic with each other about. We've got different struggles that are not exactly the same as we move toward wholeness. Kingship, queenship, in both males and females, that's the hardest thing to attain in a mature way. You get it in your prince and princess years, but it's not a mature expression. That's the narcissistic personality disorder expression of this. And in the 50s, both males and females have an opportunity to bring this generativity online if their community has helped them develop. So we're talking about the flowering of mature personality here, the sense in which the king and the queen represent what we can be if we integrate this inclusive nurture energy with the others in a balanced way. And you see this struggle of David to do this, right? He's struggling to bring these things into union, and he gets pretty close, and then calls. So you can see the structure here. For those of you that are interested in Jungian arcane esoteric teaching, the octahedron, look at volume 9.2 of the collected works, and Jung's discussion of the structure of the self as being octahedral in shape. Our argument is that that's the contrasexual deeper in the unconscious that we have to recognize. So you females have a fully developed male pyramid, hard to incorporate, hard to relate to, and the males have a fully developed female pyramid in the unconscious, hard to connect with, hard to relate to. That fits Jung's classic theory. We don't have time to get into that. Let's go to this kingship thing. This is from the King Within book. You can see the functions, the more elaborate functions of this king biogram. This gets me to comment, and then I want to open this up for some discussion, and then we'll take a break and then discuss this further. This gets us into a discussion of David as compared with Jesus. The king in fullness is the center, is identified with the center of the world. Therefore, there's a sense in which the king archetype in this story would be identified with the ark. There is a parallel between the center and the temple, the center and the ark, the center that connects all the worlds, the center that resources the people, that brings order against evil. See, there's a symbolic connection between these different sectors around the axis mundi. And these kingship traditions, look at the Lord of the Four Quarters book of John Perry in the Paulist Press series for the mythology of that. The expression of the king is center, through which order comes, through which resources come. The king is transforming vessel. The king as procreator. That is, there's no accident that the king is sexual, because in ancient theories of kingship, he's represented as the bull. And the king brings fertility to the people. In many traditions, if you study them, when the land becomes barren, the king is killed. In many of the traditions, they expected him to commit suicide. So you get a little sense, if you are the real king, the land flourishes. If the land is not flourishing, what does that mean? You're not the real king. Your batteries are dead. We need a new one. Now, my argument that I want to engage you with on this is that the image of the Gospels around Jesus, I don't want to make this too simple. It's clear to me that in the Gospels, Jesus is presented as representing each of these energies. In fact, I think in the 4 Gospels, you see 4 different images of Jesus. In Matthew, you get a lot more emphasis on kingship traditions. In Mark, you get a lot more emphasis on warrior traditions. In Luke, you get a lot more emphasis on healer or magician traditions. And in John, you get a lot more emphasis on the lover. So there's many books that represent Jesus in each of these images. In liberal Christianity, you could never know that Jesus was a warrior. They don't like the word warrior, and I get scolded a lot for talking about the warrior in the human self. Everybody knows that that's not good. But if you look at the Christian myth, Jesus is presented in each of these in some way. But some of you have said that there's ways in which Jesus does not hold these tensions between these different aspects of the self in as clear a way as one might think. I would suggest to you this is because the focus in the traditions, the Christian traditions about Jesus, are emphasizing that this is the true king of all the worlds, and it is emphasizing kingship. What is central about the kingship dimension? King is sacrifice. The king is giving the essence of his whole being in order that there be a world. I am come that you might have life, not me. I am come that you might have life, and that more abundantly. That is the king speaking in his sacrificial role, in which sacrifice is not masochism, as a lot of people, when I lecture about the king and sacrifice, people like to say, well, that sounds masochistic to me. But kingship or queenship in the human psyche is not masochistic when it is integrated. It is a conscious commitment to sacrifice one's being that there might be world. It is conscious, it is deliberate, it is weighed, it is not masochistic. It is one of the highest flowerings of the maturity of the human spirit. And we all know that when we see it. So there's a focus in the gospel traditions and narratives upon the sacrificial. This is the true king. Who is the true king? Always in the essence of this myth. The true king is the shepherd. The true king is the good shepherd who sacrifices so that there might be a world of justice and peace. So the emphasis is a theological one in that gospel tradition, emphasizing the king dynamics more than the balanced man or woman. And so this is why I like to say, if you want an image of the archetypal masculine that is the most full, you do not look at Jesus. You look at David. David is the image of the archetypal masculine self in terms of the failed attempt to hold the 4 quarters. So this is your image of the human, and not the mythic image of the Christ in his Redeemer King, Messianic King role. And I would submit this to you, that when you are functioning out of your queen or your king, when you're into that energy, And many of you here today are into that energy. You do a lot of your work out of that king, that liberator king or liberator queen energy. I submit to you that when you're in that, you're not preoccupied with sexual issues. You see. And that is not a flaw in you. And that is to say, that is what that program is about and what it does. The problem is not losing touch with the fact that you are not an archetype. And that as a human, if you stay out of touch with these other sectors of yourself, the same thing will happen to you that happened to David. See? Like I'm always shudder when people say to me, you know, therapists, younger therapists and other clergy types and everything, they'll say to me, well, I would never commit adultery or I would never sexually abuse a client or I would never sexually exploit a parishioner. I always try to find some wood to knock on for them because that's the king or the queen talking, you know. I mean, who has got to watch the hubris of denying the power and presence of these other sectors. Now, I'm going to stop there and see if you are understanding what I'm saying about David as a male, representing a sort of a male take on the four quarters. I want to be clear about this. I did not say that David is a prototypic paradigmatic model of the human, the masculine expression of the human. I do not think he represents, as some writers have said, a paradigmatic expression of the feminine human in its own unique challenges and temptations. You know, Kierkegaard made it very clear that the masculine temptation and the feminine temptations are not the same. They're not totally symmetrical. So let me open it up there, and then you can take this wherever you want it, and then let's talk a little bit, and then we'll take a break for a few minutes and stretch, and then we will come back and talk about anything else that you want to emphasize about this. Well, let's get people's opinions on that. See, one of the things that's wrong, she's asking the question for the tape. I'll just restate this. She's saying if David is an example of the paradigmatic masculine human, where is the image of the paradigmatic feminine human? And I just wanted to start out with that before we invite comments on that by saying that the problem with patriarchal traditions in biblical narratives is that they have not bothered to try to present as much attention to the archetypal feminine as they have of the archetypal masculine. This is a very interesting kind of tragic thing. Let me point out something here. When I dialogue, as I do a lot with radical feminists today, they like to say that patriarchy is an expression of masculinity. And I say, surely of a sort of an unconscious, uninitiated, immature kind that is very narcissistic in its form. In this way, what do narcissists tend to do? They tend to assume they are everything. And in the patriarchal traditions, gender is not adequately treated. The masculine is sort of extended to say this is the human. And so what we are faced with now is a situation in which we must actually take gender far more seriously, because the human is engendered in a synoptic, bifocal way. And patriarchal, we will look in vain in the biblical tradition for an equally vibrant, powerful image of the feminine to match David. Now, then if you have an argument with that, let's hear your candidates from the scriptural tradition. But if you have some other candidates from other traditions, let's name them. Yes, somebody else back here. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's important for us to try to understand some historical reasons for that patriarch.
Mm-hmm.
the ancient Hebrews were in constant battles with the fertility cults. They survived. And or that was true, well, I don't know, through the early Christian Europe. I'm trying to get at that from the question I asked earlier today. I was rereading 2 Samuel 6 at lunch.
Yeah.
And that's mostly, David dancing before the ark.
Yes.
It was mostly about Michael. It's not about David so much. It's about what Michael said to him.
Yes.
The daughter of Saul. And their conversation about his activity. And when you go back and read about Saul and try to locate where Saul was most unfaithful to the prophetic tradition.
Yes.
It's when he had his conversations and went to the witch of Endor. I think we need to be fair somehow to the patriarchal tradition and try to ask why they were so suspicious of the feminine. And it has something to do with the fertility cults and challenges to the Yahwist religion.
Yes. Let me state your comment for the tape. He's pointing out that that in the tradition, the partner in the struggles, the other side of it was what he's calling fertility traditions that focused a lot on goddess traditions. And certainly there's a lot of history around that, and what you're emphasizing is the tradition's own take, the biblical tradition's own take on those fertility traditions. And read through the eyes of prophetic faith, magic, and any female religious leadership in these forms was considered demonic. Today, we have to look critically at the prophetic tradition about its understanding of the feminine and about the nature of these religions which had a goddess image along with the God image. I mean, so there's a lot of complicated historical argument that you need to be aware of here that is going on to this day. That is, there's a lot of historical discussion and theological discussion and psychological discussion about whether these goddess fertility traditions were as demonic as the biblical faith takes them to be. And that's something that will be argued after you and I are dead. But anyway, it's important to take that historical picture as part of the input. What we have to look at psychologically, however, forgetting that, is that from a psychological point of view, it's very important for a female psyche to have images provided by its culture which embody the four quarters in as full and powerful way as masculine images in the culture and in the spiritual traditions are provided for the males. Now, this is a controversial, think about this a minute in terms of psychology and spirituality and initiation and human development today. There are a lot of people that do not want to deal with the importance of cultural images of the masculine or of cultural images of the feminine as resources for an emerging, developing self to metabolize, to integrate into a self structure. A lot of people with lots of impressive credentials and degrees amaze me at their incredibly retarded notions of how selves form in relationship to culture. In fact, hungry little boys and hungry little girls, as they're attempting to form a mature self, are searching for recruitable mythic images through which they can experience their own psychic potentials. Follow that? And these hungry little male and female selves will take these images wherever they can get them, because they know intuitively what we forget academically, that they need mythic images in order to develop into maturity. And so when we find all these young males in the world, all over the world I want to say, who are what's that word? Binging. Who are binging on Rambo movies. Most of your human science mental health professionals haven't got the faintest idea what's going on with that. What's going on with it is the fact that our culture does not help young males, not to say young females, integrate their aggression in a mature way. So they know they've got to find things that carry this aggression and try to relate to it. They know that intuitively. Just like babies intuitively know that they have to recruit self-objects in order to develop. They don't have to be taught to do that. They just do it if anybody's around. So all these young males who are binging on Rambo movies and other violent movies are doing so in order to do something they know they have to do. They have to get their aggression integrated. And of course our leaders in our culture are not sophisticated enough to understand that. So they think if we take away all the guns and toys, G.I. Joe toys, that this will solve our aggression problem in the culture. Which in fact what it does is make it more archaic and more likely to be acted out. So we've got a situation in which this is your challenge. This is our challenge today. I mean, psychologically, culturally, and spiritually. We have got all these young people in this entire planet now, and we are not helping them have a diet, a nourishing diet of mythic images of either the masculine or the feminine. And so who have we turned this project over to? Hollywood. And those are the people who are deciding what the spiritual and psychological diet of your global young people will be. And therefore, what parts and what forms of these energies will be integrated into their functional egos, or little s selves. So, this is the big challenge. David, think about this. Now, I just want to press this thing about the significance of David just a minute. Why look at David? Do you look at him chiefly for a model for normative behavior? No. If you're a male, or if you're trying to understand men because you have a son or a husband or a boyfriend, you look at David for a clear image of the male struggle for integration and empowerment without going into a fragmenting, grandiose acting out. That is an image of the male challenge. It's not an image of the male potential. You follow me? It's an image of, it's a code for what the male shadow is that has to be dealt with now. And it's very interesting that it parallels representations in other mythic traditions about the male shadow. There are Jungians, you know, that think that myths and stories like that give you the normative vision. What is the normative vision of males? Well, David, I'm joking about this for you on the tape. This is not serious. What is the normative vision of males? Comes from mythology. Well, what? Well, a man with a harem. Right? More than one wife. A man who uses his power and does what he wants to get what he wants, and and then ends up tragically. That's normative. That's not normative. The Hebrew people knew that that's not normative. They saw that as an image of what must be overcome in order that the real David might emerge. Yes, Steve?
You're more emphasizing David's problem with grandiosity and so on.
Yes. Let me just elaborate that a minute. It's important to see what is a fully empowered person. It's a person that's really in touch with these resources we're talking about. These are deep, hardwired, archetypal resources in the psyche. An initiated person is somebody that's in connection with these in such a way that they are integrated into a cohesive self that serves life and the community. Okay, so David is paradigmatic in that he is large. He is connected with this. He is not split off from his energies. He's plugged in to all four of these sectors, right? Okay, what's the problem? Is there a problem built into the male at this point in evolution? You bet. If we look at David, do we see what it is? You bet. What is it? A fully empowered male has, because of the particular structure he's got, a tendency to use his power and aggression in ways that overwhelm him and break the cohesiveness of his self. Yeah, go ahead.
To sort of get away from our topic for today, but
okay.
What would be like a real and powerful story of a man who fails through deflation? Because there are a lot of men who are depressed.
Yeah, right.
Not green.
Yes, that's right. Well, there are Willie Loman. He's asking what would be an image of the man who fails by not integrating great energies. I'd say death of a salesman. But every man's story, you see, we are much more in danger, if you speak statistically, of abdicating our birthright by staying small and gray. So the challenge of masculinity is shown, when I say the challenge of masculinity being shown so clearly and paradigmatically with David, the challenge is to get empowered, which he does with the blessing of God, as it says in the story. This is blessed. God, David is the tradition says this, David is a man after God's own heart. That's something with sanction, In other words, something very divine about the way this guy's put together. Sacral, archetypal. But here you've got this thing that males have a hard time dealing with, and I think there's a parallel thing. Look, I'm not just male bashing here. Let's be clear about that. There are similar temptations that are not structured in exactly the same way in the feminine, and that's for another time. But the point is this: that the male, why is it so hard for the male in this powerful kingly role to accord the feminine the respect it deserves? This is full of, world mythology is full of this. The masculine as imaged in world mythology has very similar, this problem that we're seeing here is repeated over and over again in world mythology as a masculine problem. When masculines personalities get really empowered, they tend to err in these directions. Well, they're not honoring you, because she says, is that the feminine in themselves? The Jungian argument would be that they have not really worked through their narcissistic problems. they have not adequately integrated this lover dimension. The lover dimension in the psyche of every human is that which values the other in spite of any utilitarian value it might have. A lot of people like to depreciate these courtly love traditions at the medieval period. And they like to make jokes about how those knights cherished and saw the preciousness of the ladies. Well, see, I think that is really stupid and wrong-headed to not see what's going on there. Those knights and those traditions were trying to show males struggling with the preciousness and beauty of the other out of any utilitarian worth it might have, and showing the masculine experience of honoring the other, although it doesn't understand it. And that is another kind of evolutionary achievement in these chivalry traditions that's being made. A lot of people make light out of this, but my saying to that is very frankly, well, you can make all the fun of chivalry that you want, but here are your choices. You're going to have wimps, you're going to have brutes, or you're going to have knights. Now, you can show me how it's any other way, but I've got enormous evidence of all kinds to show you that it's wimps, brutes, and knights. And so it's about time that we stop depreciating. And some people have come around on this because there are a lot of people, a lot of radical feminists around the country who have realized that they're not going to be able to protect women and children without the men. And they are now speaking to their governors and their legislatures saying, where are the men? And so anyway, all the point I want legislatures saying, where are the men? And so anyway, all the point I want to get across here is if you look at David as an image of this masculine archetypal potential, and you say, well, what's the problem here? Well, and you say, well, what about the contrasexual feminine in him? Is it finished? No, obviously it's not. And I just want to mention in this context the Hindu mythical tradition Ramayana, in which the great Lord Rama, an image of the male image of God there, has exactly these same problems. And in fact, it's even clearer in the Ramayana, because there is a queen. Unlike in this tradition, the queen is lifted to a higher place. But the wonderful masculine in the Ramayana, Rama himself, has not finished his work on his narcissism. He would rather have a golden statue of his wife beside him, albeit a little bit lower on the dais, than the real woman and queen whom he has allowed to be banished to the forest with his children. And we're working now on a masculine spirituality book, and what we're going to do at the end of this book is to point out that that myth and this story leave us where we are today. An image that the empowered masculine throughout our history, as shown in David, in the story of David, and in the mythology of the Ramayana, shows that the fully empowered masculine is incomplete and must do the next mythological step of being able to get strong enough and integrated enough to actually do what the combat myth says. In other words, that combat myth, we need to read that thing for the task. What do all those stories in the combat myth cross-cultural comparison say? Well, the feminine and the children are being oppressed by monsters. They all agree on that. The king is away. The true king is away. He realizes, think prodigal son story. He comes to, aha, I have abandoned my wife and children. So he returns to the kingdom in which he engages the monsters, defeats the monsters, liberates the queen, ensures the safety of the children, and then justice and peace reign at the end of history. That is the cross-cultural combat myth, and you can tell where we are in it in the David cycle. We get so far, and then boom. That's what we see in self-psychology today. We say, well, you get so much grandiose energies integrated, and then you get overstimulated, and then you fragment. Boom. I call that premature ejaculation of the psyche. Just can't stand the ecstasy of this gold energy, this masculine gold energy, and females have their own way of doing this. You get so full of the real self in you, but you can't hold it together. And then you fragment or go into depression or addiction. So this is the male challenge. I want to emphasize that. It's a male challenge. We might ask what do you think about the female? There's got to be a parallel. We'll take a break in a minute. There's got to be some female challenges that mirror this. If men had integrated their power and stewarded it adequately in history, and they had ensured that a lot of women had been liberated in the position of theologian, and they had had the opportunity in history to elaborate those Deborah stories, we would probably have a large image. But males in the Judeo-Christian tradition, as in many, many traditions around the world, it's not just Christian, not just Judeo-Christian, have abused their power so much that they've not made it possible for women to become philosophers and theologians and so forth. And we just need to look at this the way in which, a lot of people are doing careful studies of the strong feminine images, of which there are many, but the tradition did not allow for the time and energy to go into elaborating these energies like they did the masculine. More evidence of patriarchy, see. So that's our challenge now. Let's see, I like to say, this is an exciting time. Let's see what happens if contemporary feminine mythologists and theologians now are given the space and opportunity to elaborate this story and fill it out. Let's see what it looks like. And you've got your own candidates. I've got, what am I? Sigourney Weaver in Aliens. She's magnificent. I can't wait for this summer. Aliens 3 is coming out. I get to see her do it again. This is the kind of feminine that needs to come in and kick ass, and save the children. If the men are not big enough to do it, the women will. And that's the kind of powerful female energy we have to have in this world. And the fact is that there are a lot of communities in which it's that kind of feminine energy that's stepping up and doing things. And the important thing for us to try to imagine, I keep saying, we got to re-mythologize. It's time for us to do further mythologization here. We've got to imagine, get this incredible, fantastic idea of males and females cooperating for the human future. Can you believe that? That's going to overstimulate you to have that thought. So let's take a break. Let's take a break and come back in about 5 minutes, and then we will go on until we stop. Let me start this off by saying a little bit about the Messianic hope. There's a lot of this energy now, and as I say, in the next few years, as we approach 2000, there's going to be an enormous constellation of eschatological, apocalyptic, psychological energy. Those of you who are working in mental hospitals are going to see a lot more people coming in who think they are messianic liberators, or who think they know who it is, and so forth. And what I'd like to do is just comment just briefly about this messianic hope and this hope for the real David. As we point out in this King Within book, the Jews had, especially Reformed Jews, I mean, there's a wide spectrum of expectation in the Hebrew tradition about this. You may have read in the news magazines recently about this rabbi in New York that a lot of people are saying this is the Messiah. He's about 90 years old, They've built him a house exactly in Israel that is exactly like the one in New York that he's living in now. It's like a cargo cult. It's like in the cargo cults you saw those DC-3s going over, you thought they were gods, and so you built landing fields for them. Ritual landing fields to hope that the DC-3s would land. And so it's a way in which a mythic structure, and I'm not depreciating the rabbi and his tradition, I think they're fascinating, but the idea of building him a house to entice him to come to Israel so that the cosmic regeneration will occur. And these people and a lot of fundamentalist Christians have the idea, that the Messiah comes, cosmic regeneration occurs, and if we can just get the Messiah to come by whatever means, then the cosmic regeneration will occur. That's the mythic structure. The Reformed Jews talked about the Messianic age, and they had this idea of the human, that this sort of thing, they were sort of Enlightenment people, Enlightenment thinkers, and they thought this was going to come about through rationality and education, and they would be the first to depreciate the unconscious and its energies, sort of early proto-Freudians, In other words, Freudians don't really look for the cosmos to come out of the unconscious. They expect a primary process out of the unconscious and not too much redemptive energy. But if you look at this stuff in the context of human potentials, this is where sometimes I sound a little bit like Gene Houston, in talking about the majesty of these potentials that are with us. I really believe that she's right about a lot of the things she's written about that and about the possibilities that we have. But I don't believe with the Enlightenment theologians of Reformed Judaism that it comes about merely through education, etc., sort of the Enlightenment ideals. I do believe it comes from an acknowledgement of these large forces in the psyche, which are our birthright as humans. And I do believe there's a real David, but he exists in the hardwiring of every man. And he is a potential in the psyche of every man that's not irrevocably brain damaged and has some organic brain damage of some kind. I mean, there are those people who, because of infant fetal alcohol syndrome and others that have been brain damaged in ways that limits their potential for realization. But from a Jungian point of view, these are large things that are in our birthright. They have to be contained and evoked and elicited and brought out by culture and spirituality. We might say today a team of educators, of
mental health professionals, of religious communities, civic leaders who understand the large potential that we have in the human psyche and know that their role is to create a community of a community which is, as my friend Charles Winquist has spoken of it, which creates a communion of possibility, that the human community, through its cultural resources and its spirituality, must create a communion of possibility through its social structures, which enables the evocation of these things which our species, in its magnificence, can bring forth. And I really believe that's true. And so I don't believe that these messianic fantasies that are deep in the psyche of men and women are just psychotic regressions. I think they are images which our human psyche is giving us of what we might become. We get our act together a little bit. And so this question of the hope for the real David, I don't think is an unrealistic hope, except that it won't be merely Jewish or Christian. The real David exists in the heart of every Arab, every Buddhist, in the heart of every African villager, and so forth and so on around the world. And the hope for our planetary future is going to be whether or not we can connect with this, and we can help males connect with this, and yet realize that this task that we face is large, that is, helping males to balance this archetypal given with a equally empowered feminine presence. And just briefly, let me just say a word about this problem, and then we'll open it to some more questions. Those of you that have to go at 4, just get up and leave. I'll stick around for at least another 15 minutes and discuss with the rest of you that want to stay. But let me say this. It is really hard to become empowered, period. You've got so many people who are invested in your ordinariness.
Yeah.
And would really rather you be insignificant and gray and quiet and invisible and not like David if you're a man. A lot of people, and you know, people, there's a good book by one of a couple, Anne and Barry Ulanov. Anne is a Jungian analyst, Barry's a professor of literature, and they've written this wonderful series of books. One that they've written is on Cinderella and her sisters, which is a study of envy. One of the things we have to realize is you start getting in touch with your largeness, you're going to get enormous envy attacks. Full-blown hate at you. And so the chances of, when a man or woman starts feeling the fullness of their archetypal promise, the reaction of folk around them is often much more negative than positive. In fact, if you start getting developed, you may find that you need a whole new circle of friends. Because a lot of the time your friends cannot stand you when you start feeling significant. Yes, yeah.
You also threaten the powers that be as well.
You threaten the powers that be because you say, as John Kennedy said, we can do better than this. And when you get anyone stepping forward and saying, the emperor has no clothes, is this the best that we can do for the children of Chicago? Is this the best that we can do for the oceans of the world? Is this the best we can do even when we're operating under communist vision of equality? that we poison the entirety of all of the peoples under our power. Poison them with atomic waste, poison them with toxic waste. It's the horrors that we're seeing now. Do we really believe this is the best that we can do? Well, a lot of people, by their actions and their what they do with themselves, argue that this is the most we can expect. It's very important for us to realize that people keep a low profile because of envy attacks that are come, and the fear of trying to do something different. So it's a tough struggle for you to start entertaining the possibility that you may be important for the future of your community, for the future of your state, your city, and so on. But this is your birthright, this David thing within and the female counterpart of it in your soul. So let me just open it up now. We've got some time to, yes.
That's why I think that's the challenge that you can to be a prophet. And I think part of the challenge internally, too, is to become ego grandiosity, and then you start bitching at the people, you don't do it, become negative instead of staying balanced and really inviting people to go along, or you get depressed and say, nobody likes me, nobody appreciates what I'm doing. So it gets back to the David challenge. I think you so well articulated just a minute ago.
Well, it's very important. Now, what did David have? He in his early life, like a lot of males, I argue in my work that young males, if they get support for it, as David did for a while, really get that warrior energy in there, which enables you to put on the armor and protect yourself. From attacks on you for what you're trying to do. Everybody's got to get that capacity to, if you're going to do anything, you're going to need to have your appropriate shielding, and you're going to have to know if you try to do anything, you're going to be attacked, and you might as well be ready for it. Don't be surprised. Keep a sense of humor. Sharpen your sword. I tell everybody, study a martial art. It's wonderful for keeping this part of yourself clear, so that if somebody moves in to hurt you, it doesn't surprise you. If you study Aikido, somebody moves to hurt you, your body knows what to do. And it's not an extraordinary occasion. Well, there's physical Aikido and there's mental Aikido. And there is intellectual Aikido. And there is public leadership Aikido. And so it's very important to develop the realization that if you're going to try to make a difference, you need to just be prepared for that, not be surprised. And so that's very important. The other thing is, though, you really have to decide to honor how wonderful you are. I've got a series of lectures put out by Ally Press called The Great Self Within. I gave it to a bunch of men at a men's conference, but it applies equally to men and women. And we have there's a lot that we know now about this that we didn't know. Thanks to the work of Heinz Kohut and self-psychology, we've had a revolution in understanding what a struggle it is to affirm one's legitimate greatness. And why? In other words, we know more now about the way we defend against our importance. There are actual defenses against significance. And depression is one of them. And there are a lot of others. But so you got to actually affirm that about yourself and prepare yourself to protect your gold when you show it. And there are many other things. Yes, back here. Yeah. Yes, you.
Krista commented and then a question.
Yeah.
Having worked with a lot of boys teens, I can tell you that another danger realizing potential is that when you try to climb up on a pedestal, with a boy king who's going to back you up and can't. It's true. So it's not only envy from below, it's also going to be the people from above are going to be ready to stop on your hands. And
The Saul figure. I mean, if you study this story, David loves Saul. It's, no matter what, he loves Saul. I wish we had more time because we need to talk about all this loving David did and the way he always got in trouble with this. He loved Saul. He loved his sons to a fault. Absalom and Amnon. But Saul in this doesn't have some things David has got. He doesn't have the sense of election and blessing. And so that's typical of the Shadow King. And so he's going to kill you if you start showing some gold. So you're absolutely right. And, there are a lot of people that talk about this stuff now, and we've really got to hold their feet to the fire on it because the mark of someone who's got this stuff integrated is how willing they are to cooperate with other empowered people in the service of a task. Alfred Adler used to say, if you keep your mind on the task, you can cooperate with practically anybody to achieve it. And if you are still lost in the narcissism, you won't be able to get the mind on the task. It'll be on whether or not you're kissing me in the right portion of my anatomy at the right time, sufficient number of times a day. See. And this is a big struggle. I try to work a lot with leaders of men's groups around the country on this because, it's not just a problem for women's leadership in the women's movement or of black leadership in the civil rights movement. It's a problem of all of us. How many strong leaders can we tolerate? See, and this is the big problem. And it's a challenge to us to see how well we cooperate with other strong people. Yeah, Mary?
I have an observation. Not completely dealing with what we're doing here. I've been listening to people that work. I work at a company that does government contracts, so it's equal opportunity. You were just talking about, Russia, the idea of equality. This does not do much for one's grandiosity, even if it's for sending it or trying to do the best you can or something like that. I find that there's building hostility of the white American males against the so-called, quote, equal opportunity because what it is degraded to is not if a black comes in, a white comes in, or the best man win. What it's degrading to and what the government says is, you have to have X percent of this, X percent of that, and it's not a matter of who's good or just qualified. It's, we need a black person here. Then you hired a black. Doesn't matter if he's qualified or the Oriental, but because you'd have to have a Tolga. And I am hearing from the white males, there's a lot of resentment to this. And in a certain way, I can understand that too. Can you?
Yeah, let me just comment. She's talking about all of the tension in our society about what's been called affirmative action programs and quotas around different minorities and so forth. This is the kind of thing that happens when there's not enough generativity in a society which can imagine power and resources in other than what we call a zero-sum game way. When you don't have any good king and queen energy at the heart of a society, everybody thinks in terms merely of scarcity. And they think a small pie. And then they think we're going to divide up this small pie and we're going to have a certain sectoring it out depending on who's got political power. I mean, that's really what it amounts to. And that's what happens when you don't have a connection with generativity in a society. When you have generativity in a society, the situations are are attacked which have to do with this fantasy of scarcity. Those of you that have to go at 4, go ahead. Thank you so much for coming. See you in Hyde Park. So anyway, there's also a tendency in these things, because there's not enough of this king and queen energy and generativity, to assume you can leave certain folks out. That is, you don't have to worry about the feelings of any particular group. You know, you're going to have a quota and not worry about anybody in particular group's feelings. And the king and queen stuff never excludes, but it's not merely a quota business. It's a sense of connection, empathic connection to the feelings and needs of all of these people. So I think we have to say that it would pay for us to be concerned about the feelings of males and white males in our culture. The fantasy that we can make the changes in our nation without some empathic connection to white males is sort of misguided, because a lot of those white males have enormous power. It would seem to me that we ought to include them in the human species and not let them simply carry the demonization for the rest of the culture, which happens in a lot of intellectual circles. You know, it is open season on males in a lot of places, and on white males in particular. You know, it's okay to say anything in the world about them that you couldn't get away with in other places. So I think we need to be sensitive to this, that king and queen energy includes empathic concern for all parts of the group, and we will get a lot further in changing the world if we don't draw the circle in such a way that there's a certain group that we don't care about their feelings. So that's the main thing I think we need to realize, and that in our society, the low levels of productivity, I don't know whether you've noticed lately the studies of productivity, GNP, increase in GNP and so forth in our society, the incredibly low growth rates in terms of productivity. That's because of this lack of generativity stuff. So that's going to mean smaller pie, and I'll guarantee you something. When there's no generativity in a society, it's going to mean that there's going to be more tribalization, more splitting, more factionalism, less cooperation, more fighting over who's getting their adequate share of the pie. So our challenge is around this king and queen thing. Are we going to have any rejuvenation in our society at the heart of our society, so that we don't exclude anybody, and we try to resource a regeneration of our society, not just our society? Yeah, Charles.
I'd like to make a couple of quick comments relative to that.
Sure.
I was trying to think about this. I think the key is an empathic understanding, and I think that one of the keys is that one has to develop to a point where there is a level of empathic understanding that's cross-racial and gender line. And that's key. A couple of things I want to say real quick that I was thinking about, and I don't think it's in David, but that's the idea of growing to the point where the leader who may be at the center of the axis mundi has a level of empathic growth that at some point they know when they need to move out of that position and be generative to someone younger.
Mentoring stuff.
Mentoring.
Charles Payne is talking about, for the tape, he's talking about the importance of generativity expressing itself in empowering of younger people as they come up into leadership. Go ahead, Charles.
And it's so difficult, I think, for many people, especially as they have not really fully reached that level, to move out from power, because the power they have is a false power.
Or to a different expression of their power. And see, generativity, we got to really do more and more study of this generativity thing. in that king and queen sector of the psyche, because he's emphasizing the way in which true generativity doesn't just hoard power for itself. It empowers the other and is unsatisfied with the lack of empowerment of the other. And when it gets older, it puts increasing amounts of energy into empowering the younger folk and the disenfranchised.
You could imagine a thing that Saul, that have that kind of power, he would have been happy to move into a different expression of it and let David necessary come.
Right. It's fun to think about what would have happened if Saul had his act together.
I'm going to build the affirmative action. I think the affirmative action thing, the numbers thing, is symptomatic, but probably has an idolatry that's really, this is not the place to go into again. But I do want to point out 2 points that have problems I think that whites and blacks have. I think a lot of blacks who get to some level like that have to deal with an insecurity of, whether or not they got into that position because they actually had the capability, or was it because there was a numbers game. On the other hand, I think that it is possible for whites or whoever is in power, oftentimes, to select someone to replace them who they know is about to fail in the first place. And those are...
There's a lot to be discussed about that, and we really don't have time to get into that. But it's related to the psychology of leadership, which is, we're really looking at the foundations of the psychology of leadership today. And one thing I want to close with, and then those of you who can stay, we'll stick around and talk a little bit. But the important thing to get about this challenge of kingship imaged in David is that this is not like a bureaucratic thing or simply a professional classes thing. One of the problems is so many people in our society are still in this fantasy of becoming professionally successful, making it, moving to this suburb or that suburb or this housing place, that's exclusive. As we say, getting their own and then just forgetting about the rest that didn't make it. The kingship thing that we see here in David is uniting the tribes, but also uniting the northern and southern kingdoms. I mean, all that stuff, no one is left out. And the concern is a redemptive vision. David is the prototypical image of the shepherd of the people. And so when the real leader is fully empowered and mature, whether female or male, and I might add this is a challenge to both genders, they do not write anyone off. And I have come increasingly in my own work and my own political work around the country to listen very carefully to the way people talk. And when I hear, that's my litmus test now. When I hear that some people are expendable, then I know they haven't done their king or queen work. And so for the purposes of our formal discussion, I think David tried to include the people, the tribes, the kingdoms, and he sought, under God's blessing, as the story goes, to become empowered fully enough and committed fully enough to be large enough to do that. That is a challenge. And then after you get empowered, you're going to need your Nathans to help keep you honest and your feet to the fire so that you don't betray the people that are working so hard to help you do what it is that need to be done. Thank you very much for coming today. It's been a pleasure, and I'll stick around a few minutes to talk with those of you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you.